What are the creepiest urban legends from your area? There used to be an insane asylum by my house in the 70s. It is probably 5 minutes away from my house if that. But they tore it down in the 90s because it was just a giant eyesore and had a dark history of mistreating patients. There is a cemetery on the property with hundreds of unnamed people who died there. In the early 2000s, Walmart bought the land and wanted to build a Walmart there since you would be able to see it from the highway. They excavated and such, and the day before they were set to start construction, a huge landslide happened in the middle of the night that blocked the highway for days. If it would have happened at rush hour, tons of people would have died. Ultimately, it was deemed unsafe territory to build on, so it remains empty, except for all the bike trails through the area. But no one ever rides during nighttime lol. I guess the people who died there didn't want to be chilling underneath a Walmart aisle 10. We have a chair that's been under shade since the 1960s in our school's boiler room. The janitor swears that a boy got locked down there by these other kids the day before summer break and died from the heat. He claims that the chair moves and that the door handle moves, like he's still there trying to get out. I bet the janitor sleeps in that chair and use that legend to explain the chair. I live in Romania, and as a kid the most common legend was the black ambulance that would steal kids and harvest their organs, and that kids' bodies were to be found a few days later abandoned on a field with some money for the funeral. Also, in my town our parents would never let us go to the cinema because there was this legend about a man who would put AIDS-infected needles on the seats. At least they were nice to put funeral money though. Not really creepy, but there's one house in my hometown that is said to be haunted. There's a tray with a golden teapot on it, and the tray has scratch marks on it. That tray has been sitting in the same location for years, remaining completely under shade, and still, to this day no one has touched it. Some of my friends insist that it's haunted. There's also an urban legend about how an electrician, or someone with a similar job, fell off of a ladder while setting up one of the lights in the middle school gym. His ghost is said to haunt the gym at night whenever the lights are turned off. Not my current area, but one of the primary schools I went to had a few trees in the back corner of the field with a mountain of dirt. There were rumors that it was haunted with horses. Of all things lol, there was one black horse that was evil. And if you sat under the trees and closed your eyes, you could hear the horses. It wasn't until I was older that I found out the school was built on an old racing ground and it closed down after one of the jockeys poisoned a competitor's black horse. Sounds like Bad Horse's origin story. You know, the thoroughbred of sin. There's one that I'm actually connected to. There was this friend I had in 3rd grade. He was cool and we had a lot of the same interests. He always sat with me at lunch and played with me during recess. One day he was acting weird. He said that there were bugs in his brain. I asked him if he was okay, but he never responded. I didn't see him at lunch or recess either. He didn't come to school for 3 days, so I asked the teacher what happened to him, and she just said it's not your business. I never saw him again. Afterwards, other kids in my class started making up bullshit stories about how he ran into the woods and drowned in the lake or got kidnapped by an escaped convict, and as his friend I was obviously very offended by these kids making horror stories out of this guy I really cared about. Now 10 years later, the kids in my town are still perpetuating these myths. I just think it's crazy that this generation of kids who were literally infants when this happened are still talking about it like it's an urban myth. None of them know the true story, and neither do I, but they sure as hell don't know that I knew this kid who they believe these legends about. There's an abandoned mental asylum near where I used to live. People would of course say it is haunted and dare one another to go there at night. But the weird thing is, it draws people in. If you find yourself driving late at night, you might end up driving on the grounds of the asylum out of nowhere. This happened to me and my mom once. Somehow we got off at the wrong exit, several exits from our normal exit, and wound up on the grounds of the asylum. Shouldn't even be possible. There are gates that are supposed to be closed and locked. I remember my mom and I were freaked out, and for a second I thought I saw faces looking out from the windows of the asylum, lights flickering on and off. We managed to find our way out through the main gate again shortly after. Why the hell am I reading this so late? There's an enormous wooden railroad trestle not too far from me. Tracks are still in use, and the legend goes that one day in the 1940s, when the area was super rural, a teenage boy decided to kill himself. As the road passing under the trestle was the only way to access the houses beyond it at that time, he elected to hang himself from the beam directly above the road, so his parents would be forced to see him when they return home. I normally don't believe in this sort of thing, but if you look closely you can still see marks in the timber above the road that looks suspicious, like a rope rubbed against it. Draw your own conclusions. Conclusions. Disclaimer, I don't really remember the story because I haven't heard it since I was younger and English is my second language, so bear with me. So I had this friend who lived across the street from a graveyard, and she had been living there for maybe 10 to 15 years at that point, and one night around midnight she looked out her window and saw a man hanging and swinging from a tree in the graveyard. She said she saw his face, and it was like he was staring back at her. But anyways, the next morning police come take the man and do their thing. Ever since that night she hears knocks on her door and a person walking around her house, and there would be nobody, but every so often she would look out her window and see that man staring back at her. In Eri, Angola, there is something called pigmen. The story is about this farmer who hated to be bothered. These kids every day would go bother him. So to warn the kids he would chop pigs' heads off and put them on sticks and put them in front of his house to warn people off. One day he was extra busy and these kids messed with him. He kidnapped them and cut off their heads one by one, making the other kids watch what was going to happen to them. He put the heads on sticks and put them in front of his house. The real story behind it is the most horrific train accident in Eri, Angola. More than 50 people died, 2 got away. There's more to the story. Look it up if you want to know more. There was this colonel who founded the town a couple hours south of my hometown in the 1700s. He had an affair with a young woman, and when she got pregnant he kicked her out of town and she raised their son alone for several years. When she came back and begged him for help raising their kid, he publicly declared her a witch and had her burned to death. After she was burned and they were taking her body away, her son tried to take her body from them so she could be buried on his property. He tried to pull her corpse from them by the leg, but it snapped off due to how scorched her body was. He took the leg and said it would be buried near his home. Before he left, however, he told the colonel, his biological father, that he hoped the colonel's memory would always be tainted by what he did to his former mistress. After the colonel died, a tomb was erected for him, but overnight a leg-shaped stain appeared right at the face of it. People tried to remove the stain, but it wouldn't go away. Eventually, they just replaced the stone on the tomb entirely, only for a new identical stain to appear in the exact same spot on the new stone. The stain is still there to this day, and it's a big tourist attraction in the area. My hometown growing up as an urban legend about the 7 gates of hell where, if you pass through all 7 you end up in hell. According to one legend, a mental institution was erected in a remote location so as to isolate people deemed insane from the rest of the world. One day in the 1900s, a fire broke out, and, due to its remoteness, firefighters could not reach the hospital in time to save it. Many patients died in the flames, while others escaped and were soon beaten to death. Some say that the gates were put up by the local search party to trap the remaining inmates. I grew up in southern Utah near the Four Corners. In other words, Skinwalker country. I have lots of creepy stories about them, both from my own experiences and the experiences of others, but chances are a lot of you guys won't believe, and they probably belong to a different subreddit. However, the creepiest thing about them is that everyone, and I mean everyone, is scared of them. Most of the people in my town are farmers and overall pretty pragmatic people who aren't white K to believe or make up ghost stories. And yet, whenever I would ask an adult what are skinwalkers growing up, the answer I always got was a very serious "we don't talk about skinwalkers." Whether you believe in them or not, you have to admit that the ubiquity of that attitude in my hometown is pretty weird. In a neighboring town, there lies a tree known as the Devil's Tree. It has no leaves and never grows leaves. It has been dead for years and still hasn't fallen. It was the site of many lynchings back in the day and is said to be connected to a gateway to hell itself. Snow melts around the tree, and people have tried taking the tree down before to no avail. It is said that anyone who disrespects the tree in any way meets a gruesome fate. One such instance was of an 18-year-old football player who was out with his buddies when he thought it would be funny to piss on the tree. As they left, he floored it down the road, and his headlights went out, causing him to crash, and he lost his life. IDK about the stories of the tree, but I've seen it, it's real. Snow doesn't go around it, and it stands to this day, dead as dead could be. It is the only tree in a large open field, and many question why it hasn't been taken down, only to be reminded of why. There's a twisty road in the hills of San Jose, California which forks at one point and will allegedly lead you into an unfriendly albino community. The legends say that teens who drive down their road at night will be chased and threatened at gunpoint by the albino people who live there. There's all these descriptions about red glowing eyes and even some stories that mention cannibalism. I'm sure the stories are greatly exaggerated, and the residents there just don't appreciate trespassing. But I do sometimes get a creepy feeling when I'm in the area. You can look up the legend by googling Hicks Road albinos. Not in my area, but here in the Philippines in the Clark, Pampanga region, the oldest abandoned hospital sits just there. Apparently if you go inside this hospital at night, you could pretty much hear women crying, cold areas, someone throwing you something. This now abandoned hospital used to be the hospital for the soldiers during the WW2 where a lot of them died right then and there. It has a bloody past and apparently, people have tried to demolish the building, but can't push through WBC. The hospital was cursed. The guy who's about to demolish it apparently got sick on the day of. There's a building that's known for being extremely haunted due to a fire that killed a lot of people in the 70s, and some claim it was already cursed before the fire, because it was built over where a murder victim's body was stuffed in a well. Some people tried to escape the fire by getting in the elevator. They all died. Their remains so badly charred that they couldn't be recognized and were buried in an anonymous collective grave. It's said that if you go to that grave, you hear their agonizing moans and screams, but it quiets down if you pour water on the gravel soil.